Hello, everybody. It's me. I just thought I would make a small little video about a history behind DNA and history altogether. And it might be a little bit more about my family and what I found out, but it can go into other things too. So I hope you like this. There's a lot of history behind it, and a lot of interesting facts to a point. Um, well, I took a Geno test, which one was through Ancestry, one was through 23andMe, My Heritage. Um, and there's some other ones that I took, but the main ones I'm gonna do is, well, through my Ancestry. My highest is Welsh because that's mostly my mom. That is my mom all the way. And I think that was like 43%, something like that. And then my second is indigenous to to the Mexico area and part of the US like the Rio Grande, the Texas area, those areas. So it's part of the US going into Mexico also. And that's about and then also I got sent not just North indigenous, but I also have Central indigenous. So somebody came from over I don't know where. I'm still researching that stuff, but somebody came from Central America. I'm not sure if they were full Indian at the time or they were mixed with Indian and white. I mean, European. Could be indigenous and African. Don't know. They were mixed, maybe, but they came from Central America and mixed in with what is now Mexico and part of the US. Um, so altogether, with my North American and my Central American, it's about 21 to 25% in ranging. And then it's Spanish, like Spain, which that's definitely my dad. Portugal, that's my dad. The indigenous is my dad. All the Welsh is my mom. The English, my mom. And then from there, it was Basque. They call it Basque. And I think that's like a little country between Spain and France. And I guess somebody came from Basque. And there's a little bit of Italian, which that's from my dad. The Basque is from my dad. And then there's Sephardic Jewish and Ashkenazi Jewish. That's from my dad, which I think I'm like 2% Ashkenazi Jewish and I think 2% Sephardic Jewish. And then from there, on my ancestry, there's German, which is that's definitely my mom because that's my mom. But it's only 1%. but it's that small, which it did pass on. So, and there is also there was Cameroon, Congo, West Bantu, which I think that's a part of an Africa. Um, that is on my ancestry. And a Mediterranean, what do you call it? Mediterranean, somewhere around there, like Turkey, the Jordan, places like that, which it makes sense again. Um, some of the main things that showed up on my ancestry. But when I went to 23andMe, it's basically almost the same thing. My Welsh is the highest on 23andMe. And my second highest again is Indigenous. This time it says 20.8%, which it could be more if you range it. But and then there's Ashkenazi Jewish, there's Basque, but this time they didn't pick up the Sephardic Jewish, but only Ancestry did. It's really weird. Portuguese in Spain, which makes sense again. And then when you go down, it says North Africa and the Arab tribes, which makes sense if you put history together. Um, a lot of Latino people carry this, especially the North African and the Arab tribes, because it's very, very, very small, but it's there and it makes sense. Because if you put the history together, North Africa and West Asia conquered a part of Spain in the 700s, somewhere around there, and it was um, a Muslim country at that time. Not all Spain, but the part of the Spain that they invaded, they took over, and it became very Muslim. And they conquered that part of Spain together, and they didn't bring many of their African women or their West Asian women with them, so they married the people that were in Spain at the time. And the majority of the people that were in Spain at the time before they invaded were European or Jewish, basically. Sephardic Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish. They were all Jewish people and European people migrating from, um, could be England, could be Scandinavia, could be more of the Germanic tribes, Greece, places like that, Italy. It was mainly, and that's where all the mixing happened between um, the North African, the like Turkey, West Asia. It all comes together. It all starts to make sense why we got that. And in, I think it was like 1492, finally, the Spanish monarchy or the Spanish king and queen at the time got the Franks and they invaded the Moorish part of the Spain at that time. They were taking their Spain back basically from the Muslim world. And that's when the Inquisition went on. That's when they started the Inquisition. Basically, they had a choice. They would um, have the opportunity to convert to to what they call Christianity, or they had to exile Spain. And a lot of people, a lot of North Africans, Jews, and all their mixed offspring a lot of them went back to North Africa. Some never went back to North Africa, but colonized other parts of Europe. But also, some did convert, but underneath the table, they were secretly still worshiping their faith in secret, their Judaism and their Muslim faith. But if they got caught doing it, they would they would have been burnt at the stake alive. That is torturous. I couldn't even imagine being burnt at a stake alive. But some of them did convert. I'm not gonna say that they did it willingly because they probably didn't. And I'm not gonna say that they fully their heart was in it because maybe they were worshiping secretly under the table. But a lot of them, when it came to Christopher Columbus wanting to travel to new lands and stuff like that, he basically asked, the Spanish monarchy or the king or the queen, um, about like lands that they could go get goods, and all this kind of stuff and start colonizing. And so a lot of they call them converso Jews. Those are basically Jews that converted to Christianity, even though their heart really wasn't in it. Maybe it was some of them, but not all. But this is where the Geno comes in because a lot of them went to the new colonies, like North America, which is now Mexico, US, Canada, Central America, South America, which, it's South America is like um, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, all around that area, all the way to Central, like it could be as far as Venezuela and Dominican Republic and Cuba, Colombia, El Salvador, um, Nicaragua, Panama, all sorts of places like that. They all colonized those places. And everybody has this assumption that all um, the people that colonized were European that were on there. That was all from Spain. No, it was basically a mixed group of people that were on those boats that came across and conquered. And when I looked at some documentation, there was a lot of Spanish people on there, Portuguese, Italian, Greek, and some Basque. You see some French, two Irishmen. You saw Moors, you saw Berbers, you saw like I'm not sure if I said converso Jews. You saw a lot of those, and then at the same time, you saw people coming from West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. Central Africa. They were coming all over Africa also. So it was a mixed population of people, but I think most, I'm not going to say all, because some of them I saw that were free. He was already mixed race. He might have been one of the mixture of the North African and the European or the Jewish that kind of mixed in when the Muslim world was before, one of the mixed offspring of them. And he was free. So he willingly did do it. But there was a lot that were slaves. But the first ships came along with the Spaniards um, in 1493, I think, something like that. And they came to conquer with them because that's the way they won their freedom, through military service. And a lot of them were willing to do whatever to be free. Who wouldn't? Even if it meant to conquer the indigenous people that were here. People don't talk about that stuff. They just categorize it as, oh, it was all white people, which it wasn't. People don't like to hear about that. People don't like it. But it's the truth. The truth is what it is. There's a dark history when it comes to colonization and then slavery, what they were willing to do to be free. Who wouldn't? You know, who wants to be a slave? So they were willing to do military service to be free, if that was what it meant. And to some of them were free from baptism. Like if they got baptized, converted to Christianity, they were free. See, the Spanish were they had laws when it came to owning slaves, how they treated them and everything. But when it came to like the European and the French, they treated them really bad. Because I saw documentation about, I'm not sure what family they originate to today, but he was an African man that was enslaved in Mexico, what is now Mexico, but back then they called it New Spain. And he was supposed to be sold to the French colonies. And when he heard about that, he killed himself because he wasn't going to be treated in that way. Because he saw the way that they treated their slaves and he was not going to put up with it. And he wasn't going to have their master, what master owned him at the time, to profit off of him so he could be mistreated so badly. No. So he killed himself. That's sad. There's many documentations you can look through. It's amazing what you find. But like I want to continue, but that makes sense why I got the North African and I got the Arab tribes. It makes sense. And then there's what was it? Like Mesopotamia, Levantine. That's more like I said again, Turkey. Mesopotamia is more like the Middle East, which makes sense. Maybe the Sephardic Jewish, maybe those um like the Sephardic Jewish, like through the Jordan into the Middle East. Makes sense. Um, and then there's Southeast Africa, and I was trying to figure out how did that happen? But but then it says like I'm 7% unknown because supposedly if my ancestors were mixing and mixing for hundreds of years, past 500 years, it's harder for them to determine that genome because it could be similar to the ones um, that I already have, or the genome is just don't have the enough DNA from others um, to really see it. You know what I'm saying? Which I feel like my family has been mixing on my dad's side for not just hundreds of years, but probably thousands of years. Um, because I think the North African, it could be, um, it's very small though, but it's there. Um, it could be the Jewish, the Egyptian or Mozambique, like around those areas, which would make sense. Uh, but that's the main things that showed up in my genome. And when I took my heritage, it showed up as Welsh again, Indigenous again, my two highest. And then Spain, Portugal, and then it showed up as West Asia, which it makes sense again. But it's like they're only picking and choosing what. But then I took a living DNA or something. They picked up the Sephardic Jewish. It's amazing. Like different DNAs are showing up. Like if you, I'm just wondering if the Sephardic Jewish could be the Middle East because they say a lot of the Sephardic Jewish traveled from the Middle East into um into Spain, which the Ashkenazi Jewish people, they're probably the ones that never went back and just colonized within the European colonies. They never went back to Jerusalem when the others did. They just settled in Europe, in the European of Spain, or other European countries, which they do originate still from that Jewish, family line coming from Abraham and all that. But it's just when they did it, it became part of their genome. Like if they were there, maybe the Ashkenazi Jewish were there in the European countries, um, maybe in the day of the Bible, and they never went back. They never went back to Jerusalem, but the Sephardic Jewish did. That's why they still carrying that Middle Eastern genome. Maybe that's where they're picking that up at. But they also say West Asia, which that makes sense too. That's the Arab tribes. So it all makes sense when it all comes down to it. And I was able to trace my Jewish ancestry back to the original um person that originally first came here as a general, like sergeant general or something like that. Um his name was Marcus Dilar Garza Falcon Arcon. And it's like he did away with his Jewish name. I'm not sure if it's Arcon, Alcon, or Arcon, but the whole Arcon, Alcon, whatever it is, it disappeared. He did away with that. And his name was Alonso. He did away with that. I'm not sure, to take the focus off of him from being Jewish, because at the time the Inquisition was going on, if you cause attention to yourself, that things could land up really bad for you. And maybe he didn't want that for him or his children. Um, all I know, I'm not sure if he's the Sephardic Jewish or he's Ashkenazi Jewish. Not sure. But all I know is he settled what is now Mexico. Um, but back then it was called New Spain. It wasn't even called Mexico at the time. He settled there and had his family there. And he married a Torovino. So he married and also I think he married two or three times. But I think my family's to Trovino, the Trovino, and the Garza de la Garza from him, and the Trovino through his wife. So I think I came from his first or second wife. Sure. Which is first, but I know he had children with maybe two other women, and I think those were eventually his wives too. So I'm not sure what happened to her, but he came here in the 1500s. He settled here, had all his children here, which is now Mexico and part of the US, which back then there was no borders. So part of what is now part of the US was part of the New Spain at the time. So I don't know. Um, but he had lots of kids, because when I check my Geno and I have many matches, there's many people that share the Geno through him. The De La Garza, the Garza, the Torvino, the Falcon, they all come from that Jewish. And every time someone takes a Geno and they land up with the De La Garza, the Torvino, the Falcon, we all end up being related somehow. So, it's so amazing. But I was able to find that out. Some things I didn't mind about the family, but some things I didn't like what they did. They basically, um, the patriarch, Marcus, the first colonizer of what is now New Spain or part of the US, um, he owned a plantation. I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. Um, I'm not sure how many he owned African slaves. He owned mixed race slaves, indigenous slaves. That means maybe what they categorized as mulatto back when, which we don't do that now. We just categorize people as just you're mixed. That's it. But he's my grandfather, I'm not sure what you would call him, like maybe my 10th, 11th grandfather back. Um, all I know is one of his sons, when I looked in history, one of his sons, Pedro in Spanish, but Peter in English, he would go up to a specific slave girl's room, and she was categorized as mixed race, as the M. So she was half African and half white. He would go up to her room every night and didn't even come out till the next morning. And then 9 months later, there's a little girl that was born. I think her name was Elena Garza, and she was categorized as being lighter mulatto. That means she was to the point where she was almost passing for white, but not quite yet, because her mother was already mixed race, and then he's Jewish. So she was basically whatever European her mother was and what African her mother was, um, and Jewish. But eventually, the grandfather freed her when she turned about 16, I think. But she yep, I'm not sure what happened to the mother of her, if she stayed in slavery or she died as a slave. I don't know. But I know eventually she was free. But she didn't have to pay for her freedom. Most people had to pay for their own freedom if their master was willing to let them go. He just willingly let her go. I just think maybe it was a conscious thing. Maybe he looked at her and couldn't help to see his family in her, and he just couldn't deal with that. So he freed her to relieve his conscience, maybe. I don't know. But eventually, she married, and she married what they call a mestizo, somebody that was half Indian and half European. So there you go. You start mixing more Gino. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, she is one of my family's ancestors. She might have been she's one of my back when grandparents. And then that's so confusing because you're part, you're part of being master to them, your family, but at the same time, you're enslaved within it. It's so weird. It's like my family so, I don't know, it's complex and complicated, especially on my dad's side, because there's a lot of Indian mixing. The Indian is very big, because I think my dad is, at least, like I said, he is like 36 to 40% if you range it. And I'm only 21 to 25%. See how it gets watered down every time another Gino comes in and mixes in? It depends on what you mix with. And my mother's European, so now I'm 76% white. And then the rest of me is non white, mixed with everything else. But I just did not like that history part of it. It's really sad history, because supposedly she was a little servant within the house, like her mother was. And I mean, was it willing or was it not? I don't know. I mean, he was in the bedroom every night, all night till next morning. I don't know. That sounds willing to me. Maybe they both lost it for each other. I mean, it did happen. Slaves and slave owners or sons or whatever enjoyed each other's company, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure if he loved her or he loved her or she loved him. I don't know. But all I know, there was a little girl born 9 months later, and she was categorized with a little mark, like an X or like a cross out, because they didn't want to know who the father was. But it's obvious when each generation gets lighter, it's going to be a European person or somebody that is of lighter culture. It's obvious. But that is one info that I found out. Ah, but yeah, I was able to find the Jewish family back when. And there's a lot of stuff and these were converso Jews. Um, but it's very interesting. When I found my matches, um, I found matches in what is now some in Puerto Rico, all over the US, in Mexico, of course. My family's been there for how long? And around California, which all makes sense. California, um, Texas, and all that, all around those areas, more of the West. And I did find only a few in Florida, not too many. Only a few in Puerto Rico. I had a match in Chile, Colombia, um, Peru, Argentina, Cuba, Colombia, and I found one in Uganda, but they had a like a old Spanish name. So I'm not sure if they're the original Africans from Uganda or there was some sort of mixing with one of my, long distant, Spanish family member that mixed in with them. And maybe they're a mixed offspring. I don't know. And then there was some in South Africa. Um, the Emirates. I found one in the Emirates. I found that interesting. But they still had a Spanish last name. So I'm just wondering if some people in my family, maybe they're in the military, or maybe they intermarried and they went to their country and stayed there. I don't know. That's interesting information. But I found some in New Zealand, one in Germany, which that might be the German relative that we are hooked, we have a geno with. All over England. There was one in Ireland, but I have no Irish. Um, Wales. There was in Wales, of course. All over England. There was one in Scandinavia, New Zealand, Canada. There was a lot of migration to Canada through my mom's family, pretty much. But it's amazing when you look through history. how much information you can really get. I got as far when I looked at my genome, I got as far when I wanted to do my tree. I went as far as the 1800s when it came to William Barry because there's William Barry in in the UK is big. It's humongous. It is one of the most common names you could think of. Which one are you? I'm looking, which one are you? And I'm trying to get information from my uncle at the time, but he never really gave it to me. And now he's gone. He passed away. I feel like I'm missing information. I'm missing gaps. I want to fill in my tree. I want to fill in my tree. But some I was able to trace back to 1600s. But I guess my Jewish tree I was able to trace back to the 1500s. I was able to get that far with the Jewish. I'm not sure what Jewish, but I'm sure there's another Jewish there somewhere too. Um, because I'm Sephardic Jewish and Ashkenazi Jewish. So I don't know. I've been able to find some mixed ancestry when it comes to my indigenous ancestry. I see their mixed ancestry like European mixing with the indigenous. I see that because I saw one categorization. I I didn't say his name fully. It was abbreviated in some sort of weird way, but he said he was full Indian. I'm not sure what Indian tribe or what, but I'm sure it's one of the more western, southwestern Indian tribes because I think most of the Indians that I would come from is mostly from part of the US and into Mexico area down that way. And that makes sense to me. But then a lot of the northern tribes and everybody were being moved westward also. So I don't think I'm one Indian. I think I could be multiple Indian groups mixed in. Maybe they mixed in with each other. Maybe they mixed in with the European and then their mixed offspring started mixing with other mixed offspring. But this is the reason why my our Indian is so high because somebody in the 1800s was a full-blooded Indian that married a mestiza. A mestiza is somebody that is half white or European and half indigenous, or what you want to call Indian. Indian from North, South, and Central America. Because every time you say Indian, they're thinking India from India, but no. But Indian from the indigenous tribes. So, but the indigenous tribes trace way back far. I mean, when you do the lineage, um, the the you know, where one line just keeps going, and then another line keeps going, um, through males and through females. What would be the most in my dad's family? It's Indian because my uncle took a test and it and one lineage goes right back to an indigenous male, dating back to when? I don't know. And then when my auntie took one, the lineage goes indigenous through the female too. So that means the male and the female going way back, is Indian, is strongly Indian. But the other lines are the ones that are of the mixed origin, where like the Europeans and the Africans and the Jews and the Arab tribes all mixed in with each other somehow throughout each generation. Maybe they mixed already. Some of them were already mixed by the time they already colonized North America. Some of them were already mixed. So they were bringing their mixed genome and mixing it in with the indigenous people and all that. So that's why today, when most Latino people, Hispanic people take a genome, a lot of them, don't be surprised. You're going to find Jewish, you're going to find African, indigenous, different white groups, maybe some Middle Eastern, Jews. I already said Jews, the Arab tribes, and things like that. Even going back to East Asia, like Mongolia, East Asia, like into China. Don't be surprised at that either, because there was mixing with them too within the Latino groups. So that's why when you take a geno and I see it all over YouTube, they're shocked. Oh my God, I got white. Yeah, hello. Especially Latino people, because we know where we have some sort of mixing in there. It's obvious. Me, it's different because I only have one Latino parent, one Hispanic parent, but I'm still carrying his genes big time. I still got his mixed geno, but my mother is European from the UK. And pretty much my mom is your basic, Welsh, English, Scandinavian, and German. That's them are the only things that showed up from my mom. I mean, there could be more things. Um, if we check like a grandparent, like maybe my grandparents have something my mother never picked up because it was so small that it didn't even take no notice. The geno just changed because it was that small and never carried on. And like if I had like two great grandparents back, maybe they could have had Irish, maybe they could have had Scottish, they could even had like North African or something else. I would have never have known it because I didn't pick it up. All I picked up was the Welsh, the English, the Scandinavian, and the German from my mom. That I know comes from my mom. Now, my dad, on the other hand, everything else comes from him, which is the Spanish, the Portuguese, Italian, the indigenous, um, what else? Basque, Sardinia, which is part of Italy. It's all in the same category, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Um, the Levantine, Ashkenazi Jewish, Sephardic Jewish, um, North African, Cameroon, Congo, West Bantu, and Nigeria shows up in my 23andMe ancestry as one of my West African ancestry also. Um, Southeast Africa, West Asia, all the way to Turkey, to the Jordan, into the Middle East, which all makes sense. A history of it makes sense. It all comes together. When you put it together, it makes sense. Why my family has those things. And that's my dad. They're just a mixed old person. That's it. And I'm just a more mixed old person because now I'm at least, like I said, 76% European of all sorts. And then the rest of me is non-white with the little, mixing here, there, da, 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 da. I only picked up like 28% of all that mixing. That was non-white. But my second highest is Indian, which I said is like about, it could range from 21 to 25%, which my father, like I said before, is ranges from 36 to 40%. As you can see, things get diluted. And when the other person comes in and you make children together, that child's DNA turns out different, especially when two parents are different. So that happens. But there's a lot of things when I looked at documentation back that I did not like about what my family has done. But at the same time, I feel sad for some of my family because they went through a lot. Slavery, having their land taken away from them, being called savages, being treated like you're not even a person because you're enslaved. It was harder, like I said, to find some of the African origins because the only reason I think I was able to find two of the mixed race was because they were eventually free. So it was easier to find them. But the other ones I couldn't find. Like like I said, the little girl that was that would eventually become my Jewish grandfather. That little girl was mixed race of European and African, and she was sold to Marcus Alonso de la Garza, Falcon, Falcone, and Alcon, and she was only 8 years old when she was sold to him. She grew up as a maidservant within the home, taking care of the family, supposedly. And then when she got older, she had sexual relations or whatever with Pedro or Peter in English, and finally had a baby 9 months later that was categorized as lighter mulatto. Um, sad. But eventually she was freed willingly without even payment. I think it was a conscious thing. I don't know what else it could have been. But he said something really kind and generous about her and let her free. Gave her freedom papers and she left. Um, and then she had children of her own. And eventually many generations, many, many, many generations. Wah! But I also found another woman. I never knew we had history in Virginia. Never did I know that. But it was in the 16 late 1600s going into the 1700s. Well, supposedly my father is related to and it could be through my mom too, not sure. Um George Calvert. I guess he was some sort of mayor or some kind of something in Virginia at the time because they were just starting a colonizing there. And I guess he owned more than one plantation. Isn't that lovely? Not. This is stuff I don't like. Um, One plantation his wife lived on with him, and they had 9 children together, but only 4 lived to adulthood because I think a lot of them died from some sort of illnesses that were going on at the time. I'm not sure what it was. But then on the other plantation, he was having relations with a slave girl. She was categorized as being Indian with the N word mulatto. Basically, one of her parents was full blooded indigenous, Indian, and one of her parents were mixed race of African and European. So basically, she was 3 in 1 already. But supposedly, she had 6 children with George Calvert, and they were categorized as passing for white, which would make sense because she's already mixed race with 3 things, which she was mostly Indian or indigenous. And then between her European and her African together, they might have been like 25%, 25%. I'm not sure which one was more or what, but between them, it was pretty equal. And her indigenous was more. But because Calvert is 100% white or European, it added the genes in there. And you mix her European with his European, the children were at least 55 to 60% European. They're almost as white as I am. I'm 76%. They're they're like 50, 55 to 60%. Almost there. But what happened was they were still slaves to them. But supposedly through a will before he died, he made a will out um that all his children would be set free, give them all their freedom. And he also freed the woman that he had the children with because he did it before he passed away because he wasn't sure if he put his will into effect and he probably was concerned that his family would fight the will and deny them their freedom and what else they would do to them. Oh no. But he freed them before anything happened to him. And that was probably the smartest thing he did. But in his will, he wanted to give all his kids, even his ex slave kids, property. He wanted to give all his property to all his kids, even his European children, all the way to his mixed ex-slave children. And this is where the wife, like he said, his white wife fought the woman in court, the ex-slave woman, which I didn't know what her name was until I got into the court documentation. Her name was Caroline Calvert, because she took his name because he owned her. And supposedly she said some the his wife said some awful things about her. Said that what was my grandmother would be it was a harlot. She took advantage of an old man. I'm not sure how old he was, but he had I think he had affection for her, because why would he let her go willingly, no payment, and let his children go just like that? I think he had affection for her. Um, yeah, she called her a harlot, taking advantage of a old frail man, and that he committed adultery, and that she was a slave girl, so she had no rights, but now she did. She was fighting her in court. But then it stops right there, because you have to go right into the index to find out more of the information, which I would have to go all the way to Virginia for that. But that's the furthest I found out about that. So I'm not sure where it landed, which I don't know. Honestly, I think she was probably denied, and her children, because I think George Calvert knew that his wife would fight her, and would have, if he didn't free them before he died, they would have never been free. They would have stayed enslaved. But I guess they left, um, some of them left and went north. But I think some might have stayed behind, because to this day, the Calvert name in my family doesn't didn't carry on. It went into Spanish names. So, but if you trace the family back as a long distance, like tracing back to the 1600s, you see the Calvert name. Oh my goodness. You could see the European Calverts, and you could see the mixed Calverts. Weird. But the mixed Calverts don't have the Calvert name anymore. We have Spanish names. Very interesting. I'm not sure what family that originated from. My grandfather's side or my grandmother's side. Very interesting though. But they were categorized as passing for white by the children. I think it might have been the mid 1700s, almost going into the 1800s. So it makes sense, because my grandfather is really lighter complected, while my grandmother is more darker complected. So it makes sense. It's starting to make sense. But when it comes to the indigenous, I'm able to see where they categorize them as mestizo, mestiza, indio, india, whatever. Indio, the indio in Spanish is Indian. In English is Indian, but indio is in Spanish. But there's like a roadblock. I want to try to trace like some more of my family back, even if it's my like where can I trace my North African family back? How far can, who, and my, some of my, West Asian, and my West African, some of them I couldn't find, but I was able to find the mixed offspring. Two of them, but it's only because they were set free. And that's probably why it was easy. But my indigenous, it was hard too because a lot of them changed their names. They were given Spanish names or European names or French names, depending on, their whole identity changed. Their whole everything about them, it just changed. I'm not sure the reason why, like, they went by who you married. Like if an indigenous person married a white person, they would categorize them as being white, even though they're not white. Same with like, I saw documentation also of a Spanish woman marrying an African man in the, I think it was like the late 1800s going into the 1900s. They categorized her as being black. Maybe she might have had black African ancestry, but they categorized her as being black, even though she was white as I was, because she was married to an African man. So weird how they categorized people back then. But there's so many gaps in my family. I could only trace some of my family back to the 1800s, like I said, some of the 1600s. The Jewish, I was able to go back to Spain to the 1500s, but then after that, nothing is found after that. It's harder, but I'm still looking. I'm still tracing. I'm still trying. I really am. But it's interesting with all the history. Some of the history I don't like, but it is what it is. Colonization was a nasty thing. My family was part of the colonization and the mistreatment, and then some of my family were the ones being mistreated. So weird. We're being oppressed, enslaved. So it's just, I don't know. And sometimes I don't blame people for being angry. When you look at that, it makes me angry. It makes me upset that my family could do that to somebody, or my family had to suffer and endure too, especially when it came to my indigenous ancestry. They lost their land, they lost their homes, they lost their total indigenous identity, they lost everything about themselves. And when it came to the African ancestry, they both were enslaved at one time. At one time, you could see Indians enslaved with the Africans and their mixed slaves with white African, Indian African, Indian African white. They were just all mixed slaves, and your pure African all the way to your mixed offspring and to your indigenous offspring. They all suffered slavery at one time, but they supposedly let the Indians go free because supposedly I read a documentation. It was a letter that went to the King of Spain, And supposedly because a lot of the indigenous tribes were dying from the European illnesses, they didn't have the immunity to their sickness. So they were dying by the millions. Some indigenous tribes were extinct, and they saw that. So what the king said, the Spanish king, he went and said, "What two Indians can do, one African can do." He says, "Africans are superhuman." Like saying mainly because what they mean is, see, the Europeans and like North Africa and all the African tribes, they have a history together. They do have a history. North Africa, West Asia, the conquering of Spain. They were around the Europeans for so long. They didn't die by the millions because they were used to being around Europeans, Jews, all that. And their immune system was strong enough to fight. So this is why they call the African the superhuman. What two Indians can do, one African you can do. And this is where the Atlantic slave trade started to become more, where it started coming by boatloads of slaves to South America, North America, Central America. Yeah. And then everybody started getting in on it. And the funny thing is, everybody says it was all only Europeans that did it. No. Now a lot of us are finding out when we take our geno that some indigenous tribes were even enslaving Africans. I hope none of my Indian tribes did that. I hope not. Because I know, and Jews did it too. As you can see, I told you a story about my Jewish family and my and how the little African got in there. And that's where the Indian, the white, and all that came in, the Jewish, and all the mixing happened. Some of it was willing, some of it was not. I'm not sure if that was, I don't know, it sounds willing to me because how do you go up to a slave girl's room and not come out until the next morning? Come on, you're enjoying each other. That's too long. That is way too long. And you did it on a basic, on a continuous basis until 9 months later. And then there's a baby born. Hello. But I'm still trying to look for the gaps that were missing in my dad's family tree, a lot in my dad's family tree, and some in my mom's family tree too. I'm not sure if there's secrets up in there that we don't know, but I'm gonna find out. I'm gonna find out. I'm just gonna keep looking. But like I said, some of like the history we find. Um, A lot of people think it was only white people that owned slaves. Through documentation, I'm finding different. I find that some indigenous tribes owned slaves, all the way to even Africans themselves after they're freed themselves. Some of them, some of them did that to because supposedly if you're freed in Virginia or like, down south somewhere back then, you have so long, so many months or so long to get out of that state unless you have property. So a lot of them sometimes bought their own family members and documented them as slaves, even though they didn't treat them as slaves. But there are some that did own slaves and treated them as slaves. I forgot, um, there was one African man that owned a breeding plantation. Yeah. And he was an ex-slave, which was set free. And he started owning a lot of slaves himself. And he owned a breeding plantation. Basically, he made have male slaves have sex with the female slaves to impregnate them, to have make him more babies so he can sell them. Um, but he also impregnated some of the slave girls himself and sold his own children. So did some of the white guys that did the same thing. I don't know who's worse than the other, but like I said, it was a man's world back then. Man dominated. I feel, I don't know, some women could be cruel too, but if you had a sensitive woman willing to stop such things, I think she would. She would do anything in her power, even if it meant her life, to stop such cruelty. But sometimes you have to watch out for your own people. And still today, we still have to do the same. We have to watch out for just people in general. We have to be careful, even within our own family members. But it's so much that we can learn from history that people don't want to know, history that people don't know and they think they know, and some history that is now changing because now they're finding out through many documentations that the information that they're given isn't accurate. And then when that truth comes to light, people don't like it. People don't like truth because when the truth comes to light, it changes your idea and your concept of what you thought was true. It was like, wow. Just like there was one woman, she found out I forgot who it was. She found out she was owned by an African man that was enslaved at one time. And he finally got himself a nice plot of land and owned slaves himself. And he owned a lot of slaves in the South. Yeah, people don't talk about that. People only talk about white people doing it. But people don't talk about Jews doing it either. But they did it. Arabs did it. Even indigenous people did it. And even Africans themselves. I'm learning that through some stuff too. because I guess there was an African man that came from the Congos. Um, he's like one of the first Africans that came to the U.S. Well, not U.S., but what is now Mexico, North America. Sorry, I wouldn't say U.S. Well, maybe it was part of the U.S. too at the time, because back then it was only colonized by, um, starting to be colonized by Spain. There was an when they conquered the indigenous tribes from their homes. Um, there was this African man that came from the Congos. They called him the Handsome Juan, or the Handsome John in English. And I guess he wrote a letter to the king of Spain, saying all the stuff that he did through military service, that he wanted his pension, and he wanted his, like freedom. Can I have this and that? Eventually, yeah, he got it because he proved that he did a lot of military service and he did conquer and he did well. Well, he got some land that was by the old Indian homes that they took away from them. Um and there was a bunch of mines there. So he got property, he got land, he got a pension, and he got his freedom at the same time. What did he do? As soon as he got that land, he got that property, he owned slaves. He owned African slaves, mixed slaves of African whites, African Indian white, and Indian slaves. He owned lots of slaves. And they would be in the mines digging for gold that were in the mines at the time. And this is the way he got rich off of the back of slaves. A slave oppressing other people, an ex-slave oppressing other people. And he was an African man right from the Congos. See, people don't talk about stuff like this. People only talk about it was a white man, it was a white man, not realizing even indigenous people, Jews, Arabs, they all were part of this, even Africans themselves, sadly. And when I hear stuff like that, it's upsetting. It makes you mad. And I get that. Because when I look at my family tree back, it makes me angry. It makes me angry that some of my family members did own slaves, but at the same time, some of my family members were slaves. So it's like they were, how do you work it? You were the oppressor and the oppressed all together into one family. And now today, a lot of us look as light as me, but also because our Indian is so big too. Um, but it's just sad. I don't know. When you hear about a little 8-year-old being sold, taken from her mother's arms, I don't even know who that woman was. I want to know who that woman was. And then she's enslaved to a master inside a house. How do they treat her? I don't know. How do they treat their slaves? Did they treat them good? Did they treat them bad? I don't know. I hope they treated them good. Was she treated well? I hope so. Because she was like one of our ancestral great 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 grandparent back when. How do you feel about that? How do you I don't know how to comp I don't know. I It makes me sad and it makes me angry. But then I'm learning from the whole history of my family. Not all people in my family believed in slavery. Mm-mm. It's like you were like families against each other when it came to that topic. Some owned slaves and some refused to own them. And I saw that in documentation. Yeah. In fact, I think some of my family might have been part of trying to get rid of slavery too. Them are the parts I like. I just don't like the other parts. But also, women's rights. I see that some of my family and my dad's side, some of them were part of establishing women's rights. That doesn't surprise me. Strong women wanting to stand up for something. Yeah, that's not a surprise to me. I'm proud of that. But just remember, we learn from our family and learn never to want to ever repeat such things ever again. Man, if I could go back and I could talk to them, I'd definitely give them a I give them a massive talking to. Oh, watch, I'd probably be slapped up and down and what else? I don't know, but oh gosh, terrible. Well, that's that for now. I just thought you would like to hear a little history when it comes to the Geno, how interesting it is, and how much you can learn from the Geno and how to, trace some family members back. And sometimes there's the big block that gets in the way. And some of it's because they weren't categorized as human, just as property. Some of them were their names changed because they thought they were savages and they needed to have proper names and proper dress and proper hairdo because a lot of the indigenous people had their long hair and you know they called them savages, which we know we're not. We know that for fact. They were just as human as the next person. All of them are just human as the next person. We all came from one family and expanded out into many families. We're all just as human as each other, no matter how white, Indian, African, Jewish, Arab, Middle Eastern, Paki, Indie, any other race. We all function the same. Everybody's heart beats. Everybody gives birth the same way. Everybody seeds a baby the same way. We feel anger. We feel love. We feel we have worries. We get sick. We're all imperfect. We all started from that same family line, but expanded out through migration. Isn't it amazing that the whole world started with one woman, one man, and through that one woman and one man became many nations, many tribes, and many tongues. Um, but of course, when the flood wiped them all out, the only survivor was what is everybody's everybody's first grandparent of the survivor is Noah and his wife. And from Noah and his wife, they had 3 children. And from their 3 children, some of us descend from one, two, or maybe even 3 of them, which I descend from 3 of them. Um, but no matter how, they all come from the same family. And then from Babel the Great, that's when the massive migration started, the confusion of languages. And from there, that's when everybody separated from each other. They didn't want to separate, but Jehovah made sure that it was going to be that way because they were doing things that were untestable to him. So here we go. And we spread abroad and we became many nations, many tribes, and many tongues of people. And no matter how, we all are part of the human family. So just remember that. Don't ever let someone talk you down, make you feel like you're less of a person or less human because you're not. You're just as human as the next person. You're just as important as the next person. Everybody has their own skill abilities, their own talents. Everybody has different attributes. That's what makes us all unique and special within ourselves. So don't ever forget that. And don't ever think that you're less of a person than the next person because you're not. You're just as human as the next person. And just remember that. We were all created in God's image. That means with his attributes. All of us like, some people like justice, some people like love, joy. Some people are have good talents in other things and other people have talents in another thing. Some people are more mild tempered with other people get more angry, but they know that we're imperfect, so we have to learn to try our best to control ourselves. Self-control. So I hope you liked this video and I hope you got a lot out of it. A lot of history out of it mostly. Um it is very interesting when you look at your family tree back. If you ever consider trying to do that or doing a DNA genome test, it's amazing what you find out. Especially when you come from Hispanic Latino families, you're going to find out you're a very mixed person. Very, very mixed person with many different backgrounds. The only reason why we're called like Mexicans or or anything like that. That doesn't make the race that we are. That's only a heritage. That's it. It's only because they named the country Mexico. That doesn't make what made us up. Or like if you're from Puerto Rico, Cuba, Colombia, that wasn't their name once upon a time. It's like when everybody won their independence from Spain. Everybody has a different story behind them. But eventually they named their country what they wanted it. And then after they just called themselves, hey, we're Mexicans, we're Puerto Ricans, hey, we're this, we're that. But just remember that doesn't make the races up what really made us. It's just because they won their independence in one way or another from Spain or from somewhere else and they named it what they wanted to name it. And then they categorize, well, what the heck? What are we? And they say, okay, what we name our country, that's what we're going to be. That's what basically it is. It's very interesting. But if you liked the history behind a lot of the DNA and tree research and stuff like that, give me a like. I hope you liked it, and hopefully, um, I'll be back with more info and give you some more videos of. I like history. I really do. I love history and the true facts of history, even though it's not liked to many people. I like truth. So, adios. Adios for now. But I'll definitely be back.